oversee who they vote for. We don't really know about that. But the fact of the matter is that we don't actually think that the idea of giving up your democratic right actually benefits the poor person in this case, because they'll it's not like market forces will just say whoever gives me the most money I will vote for them. It's not like, oh, I'm gonna have a bidding war and that will make most sense. The person I want to vote for, I'll vote for and I'll also get $15. We don't think it works like that. If I'm marginalized and I'm very poor, then it's in my best interest to just vote for the person that gives me the most money. We think that that's very problematic in and of itself. So we don't want to be buying rights. We think that that's very, very problematic. We think that rights should be reciprocal and intrinsic, as Nicole said. And why is that important? I'm just going to add on to that. Why should rights be intrinsic and reciprocal? Well, when I respect your right to vote, you respect my right to vote, and so on and so forth. So rich people who might be seen as benefited by this resolution may at some point be poor. And we think that's an important part of Canada, right? We have this right to vote no matter how wealthy or poor we get. And poor people's right to vote is sort of marginalized because now they have less power to buy or sell their votes. They're more likely to sell. So we think it's bad for the rich, it's certainly bad for the poor, and problematic overall. Yes, sir?
But if you're a poor person, wouldn't you rather have an additional option in your arsenal of choices?
No, because the fact of the matter is that what it does is it enables you to be marginalized. It enables you to be victimized by the wealthy people who are already victimizing society in many ways, right? We don't think that this additional choice is nor helpful nor meaningful for the poor people, and I'll explain exactly why. Let's say you're a poor person that doesn't want to give up your right to vote, and you vote for more liberal parties to ensure your social security. What's going to happen is we're going to get a generally more conservative party, a party that doesn't so much care about poor people, because poor people are more likely to sell their votes to rich people. So we're going to see the emergence of more conservative parties, which are generally bad for poor people. We think that the traditional parties, conservative or liberal, have more power just because they have more money. And the emergence of new parties that represent the people's views, their democratic views, not their aristocratic views, can't really come out, right? So if the people really want a certain party, they can't get that party because that party is not represented by money, that party is represented by democracy. That's what we think it should be represented under for all these reasons. Okay, so let's talk about what they said on their side. How many comments do I have? Anybody? Time? 5? 30. Okay, yes.
But people already vote based on their personal financial imperatives, based on who they will serve financially. Why not let them
exactly. So this is the whole case apparently, both sides. Oh, it's already really bad, let's make it worse. The fact of the matter is that yes, money does control votes, status quo. That's problematic. So we haven't heard any reason why this problematic status quo should be sort of exacerbated by allowing money to control votes more directly, in the words of the very honorable first proposition speaker. So, let's talk about this idea of already voting, okay? So the big problem here is that elections with ads and stuff, this sort of stuff as opposed to the direct voting, is beneficial for our democracy because people learn about the parties, right? The Liberals can't just buy my vote, they have to somehow convince me that they're the best candidate to vote for. We think that's healthy for a democracy. Instead of money being spent on informing the public about policies, it's now being spent on directly buying your vote. That is problematic, sir. If a party is planning to spend $20 on every candidate in given riding, the $20 would go to a nice sign that illustrates policies or a website, or it would go to a $20 bribe to everyone in the riding. We would prefer the former because it's healthier for our democracy and knowing stuff. Okay, we don't really know what the model is again, but that's neat. Okay, so I asked this POI, and they assume that they'll sell the best candidate. And then they couldn't really say anything because I said, well, maybe they won't sell the best candidate. Maybe they're so poor that they'll sell the person that gives them the most money, which we would argue is often going to be a more conservative, wealthy party. And the fact of the matter is, and this is a really cool argument, is that there's incentive for the party to not spend on its people and instead retain money to buy votes, right? There's incentive to actually not care about your people and just buy their votes later. We think that that's problematic. We think this argument that people can't get to polls is BS. We think that the most desperate people are going to be the people giving up their votes. Those are the people we should care about. Those are the people who should be encouraging voting, not disincentivizing to vote by giving up their vote. Yeah.
Upon the flaws of the system. So what Anisah and I are going to tell you is why this system actually improves our democracy and supports three fundamental ideals that underpin that very democracy. Firstly, I'm going to look at voters' ability to make a rational choice and how we give them an extra choice. Secondly, I'm going to look at how this improves representation of voters' interests in Parliament and particularly how it affects minor parties. And finally, I'm going to look at accountability and how this fosters and improves accountability of politicians. We think all those three things are best served through the sale of votes. So let's firstly look at this idea of choice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a complete contradiction from the opposition side of the House. Because what they've said is that they trust voters to make a decision at the polls, but they don't trust voters to make a decision about selling their votes, and they particularly don't trust poor voters. We think that a very fundamental principle in our democracy is that voters are rational individuals who do have the capacity to weigh up the benefits or the costs of a certain policy, or the benefits or the costs of a certain course of action. And what we've heard is that poor people will sell their votes because of financial pressure. But what we say is that in fact this gives poor people more of a choice. Poor people might choose to sell their votes, but we think that's fine, because we think that they're best positioned to determine whether the policy of an individual party is worth more to them than an immediate return in terms of money. We'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that when you ask yourself, how do poor people vote anyway, we think they vote on the basis of financial interest. And when you ask yourself, why do the opposition want poor people to vote, it's because they want poor people to improve their own welfare through the political system. And we think this is a great way for them to do it. We think that voters, or poor people in particular, think that they're going to get more out of $10,000 than they will out of electing, say, the Democratic Party, who may or may not reform the tax system in a way that may or may not improve their or their family's welfare. We think that's absolutely fine. We think it gives them more choice. We think choice is at the very centre of our democracy, and that's why we think we support this model. But secondly, let's have a look at representation of interests, because we think that's pretty fundamental to democracy as well. At the moment, we think the way that constituencies and elections are structured, systems like first past the post, make it incredibly difficult for minor parties who represent special interest groups to ever get a seat in Parliament. So how do we change that? Well, when we look at the Greens in Canada, ladies and gentlemen, who get 6% of the vote nationally but never get a seat in Parliament, we think that the donations that they attract, by virtue of their popularity, can't be utilised effectively, because the donations that they get are spent on advertising that has to be spread throughout elections and can't ever be centralised. So we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that minor parties can concentrate their money in a certain electorate if you allow them to buy people's votes. 6% support nationally gives you money, which you can then spend in one electorate to buy the votes of people within that electorate, and we think that way they get a seat, and that way the interests of people who support them nationally are represented.
Okay, but how are these fringe groups supposed to outspend this big established parties like the Conservative Party?
We don't think they're going to outspend big established parties, but we think that it's pretty fundamental that when people support a party, they're willing to donate money to that party, ladies and gentlemen. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, that sure, big parties like the Democrats or the Republicans will get more money, but we think minor parties do get money as well. And we'd say that the amount of money that they get is pretty proportionate to their popularity, and that's why we think that stands. But finally, let's have a look at accountability. And this is a really simple principle, ladies and gentlemen. The good thing about a vote is you get another one in 3 years' time, 4 years' time, or 5 years' time. So this is a right that kind of refreshes itself. And we'd say that we have huge accountability mechanisms in that if people think that they have made a bad choice by selling their vote, they can change their mind at the next election, and we think that's absolutely fine. So in that way, ladies and gentlemen, what we've told you today is that this improves our democracy and upholds its fundamental principles. But I want to look at two questions in rebuttal now. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask whether or not we get proper representation, and secondly, whether we're going to get a democracy for the rich. So firstly, proper representation. We'd say that representation means that you can express your interests and have someone represent those in Parliament. And as I explained in our extension today, people can't choose to do that at the moment because of the way the elections are structured. But we think that when parties can use money and use donations to concentrate their interests, concentrate their influence in one electorate, then they're going to get a seat in Parliament, and that provides proper representation. But what we heard from the opposition, and this leads into my second point of rebuttal, is that we don't get representation because only the rich are going to benefit from this system. And we've heard three things from them. Firstly, only the rich can buy votes. And we think that's rubbish, ladies and gentlemen. Sure, if you're rich, you might be able to buy, rich parties. We already have a disparity in how much money rich parties have and how much money minor parties have. But we think that all parties have some level of money, and we think that they attract money when they're popular. We think, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that movie stars hold fundraisers for the Democratic Party who aren't going to give them tax breaks, ladies and gentlemen, points to the fact that people do have a social conscience, and we don't think that everybody in society does always just vote with their pockets. But secondly, we heard poor people are going to be pressured to sell because of the financial pressures that are placed upon poor families. And I ask again, why do you want poor people to vote? It's because you think that they need to improve their own situation, their financial situation, and they need to improve their own welfare. And we say, poor people aren't stupid, ladies and gentlemen. We think that poor people are better positioned to decide whether $20,000 in the bank is worth more to them than the Democrat in Parliament. We think that's pretty fundamental. But finally, we heard we're going to get more conservative parties because poor people can't centralise or concentrate their power. And I thought that was a pretty ridiculous argument, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't think it's the right of one poor person to decide that they want to collectivise by influencing the decision that another poor person makes. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that a pretty fundamental principle in democracy is just because you're a poor person, you don't have some guarantee that every other poor person is going to think the same as you or want the same things as you. That's why we give votes to individuals and not to economic groups, ladies and gentlemen. So we'd say that we don't think we will get more conservative parties because we think that all parties will have influence on the basis of their popularity and the amount of money that they can attract. We think that rich people often support minor parties as well. We think that they're going to get money through that. So where are we at in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen? Well, what Anisah and I brought to this debate are the fundamental principles of democracy. And we've told you that not only does the current system not really serve those principles, but our system will serve them so much better. And that's why we're so proud to propose.
Okay, I'd like to thank that speaker for her remarks and call upon the member opposite.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, if there is one fundamental principle of democracy that we value so much as not let it be decided by the public, it's the idea that a democracy cannot be turned as a weapon against itself. And we think this is a fundamental principle, and fundamentally when you get on the side of the government is the idea that what is in the interest of the individual at a particular time getting money to buy the vote is actually is somehow good for a democracy. And our fundamental viewpoint is that it's bad for democracy, and if it's bad for democracy in the long run, then it's going to be bad for the individual. It's individual good at the cost of collective, detriment. So what I want to do in this speech is I want to identify a couple areas where they have overlooked some key shortcomings in their case. Then I want to move on to our extension, which is 2 points. First, a democracy of special interest. How essentially the special interests come to control the democracy through their plan. And finally, how democracy is turned as a weapon against itself. In both cases, very bad outcomes for democracy. So the tensions I want to point to, or the problems, is that on the one hand they say that mainstreaming money into the process. You hear a lot of this from open government that it's already there, we might as well incorporate it. But they don't specify, they don't take the issue head on that. Then why not have direct funding of these campaigns by major corporations? Why have any sort of limitations at all if money is in fact good for the democratic process? We think that fundamentally money corrupts the democratic process, and we've recognized this repeatedly throughout history. There's also this assumption, the second assumption that I want to address, which is the idea that there's still some sort of connection between how a person would have voted and how that organization votes for them once they purchase that vote. And it was addressed by the last speaker that somehow, you have these organizations which are quite popular, but at the end of the day, if a vote is really purchased, obviously what's of most concern to them is an economic situation. It's alleviating whatever loans they might have, whatever problems they might have. It's not a vote about politics, it's a vote about alleviating a personal crisis, debt, or a personal problem. So there is a complete disconnect in the political process between how a person would have voted and how that vote actually turns out as represented by special interests. Go ahead.
Under your system, how do minor parties and special interests get any representation at a federal level?
Well, the first thing to note about the minor parties is that where the organizations are going to go that are purchasing votes, first of all, is those which they can find large constituencies. And if you're going to, and if you have a particular party which is, or a particular group which is in the minority and is not a lot, then those special interests are not going to go toward a particular group which is only 3% of the population, whatever it might be. They want to go to where the large population are, where they can get most of the vote. I don't think that you have improved representation through your plan. I want to talk about how we create a democracy of special interest. And it's interesting to note that the government already recognized the problem, and that is we have a huge amount of apathy in democracy today. And then the problem is twofold here. You have people who feel like they were alienated from the democratic process, like their vote doesn't make much of a difference. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that there's special interest, that they feel like dominates the process. Now what happens is when somebody already is feeling disenfranchised, and if they already feel like it's very difficult for their voice to be heard, that means that you have a lot of potential for a lot of people to give up their votes. And at the point that that occurs, then you create a situation itself that in effect perpetuates itself because no longer do they have any sort of voice that's heard, and the special interests are in fact controlling it. So let's look at who the vote buyers are in this case. The special interest organizations which represent extreme views, whether it's in the United States, the National Rifle Association, organizations that are pro-life or even Planned Parenthood. Extreme views that don't represent the middle ground of America, don't represent a broad intersection of interest. Why that's problematic is because you essentially hollow out the basis of democracy if the only views that get represented, the only views that command public attention are the extreme views on either side of the spectrum. What that means is that fundamentally there's a separation of what is the public interest, which is the good of everybody, a separation from that toward how people are voting. And this is really a problem because for one thing, one reason why we've been able to identify that voter turnout is poor is because we can see that 30–40% of the population is voting, 50%. But what happens now in their policy is almost everybody's voting because those people who win a vote are very likely to sell their vote. And so you completely mask the problem of voter apathy. And so you create a system which looks solid, which looks like it's democracy, but fundamentally is run by extremist views which don't represent the public good, which are fundamentally detrimental to the long-term prospects of democracy. Which leads me to my second point. I will take you, Chris.
Okay, my question is this. How much representativeness is there in a disenfranchised person not voting, not actually revealing any kind of preferences on November 4th or whatever the election day is?
And that's my concern, is that you see this idea of voter apathy is fixed, that we might as well accept it. But if you have a choice, why hijack personal choices by buying votes instead of increasing voter turnout? Because we've seen in democracies that you can increase voter turnout. You can, in fact, have get out to vote rallies or whatever it might be. So you surrender the idea of democracy entirely because you believe that the selfish interest of individuals is sufficient. We should accept that. We should accept that as part of the democratic process, rather than challenging it, rather than trying to revitalize democracy itself. So I want to get into this idea of democracy as a weapon against itself, because there is a fundamental tenet of democracy, and that is that, well, as Chris says, you can sell your individual goods and services, you can't sell your political rights. And there's a fundamental distinction in that. So, for instance, the Canadian Charter in terms of the Canadian Charter of Rights, you can't, for instance, surrender that or waive that in exchange for $5,000, $10,000. And the reason why we think that's true is there's two issues that relate here. The first is the irreversibility of it. Now, they don't ever specify when the vote will be bought, which means that if a candidate decides to dramatically reverse their position after their vote's already purchased, then the person has no control over that in the meantime, which means that if they have no control of the process, that means there's an aspect of irreversibility to the buying of the vote. But we also recognize that political rights shouldn't be sold because we think fundamentally that it is in the interest of every individual person to have autonomy. That if they don't want to have autonomy, if they're surrendering their autonomy, they're obviously under some sort of compelling reason, so almost coercion in a sense, due to poverty, due to loans, due to a personal financial problem. And that's why we don't allow people to go into sharecropping, we don't allow people to sell their freedom, whatever it might be, because we recognize that there's one thing that we have to protect in democracy, it's the autonomy of the individual, the expression of their interests, and that's what we do in this case. We think this is fundamentally problematic and antithetic to democracy because it reverses
clarification of the round as a whole, and look at who really are the actors involved and how this changes things for everyone. So first of all, we heard about this idea about how this is going to lead to a democracy of special interest, that only these extreme groups, it gives power to these extreme groups like Planned Parenthood, like these other kinds of ideas. But what I would like to pose to that is, why do some parties have money and others don't? We think that this was a fundamental misunderstanding throughout this one team in particular and event in general. A large source of money for these parties is popularity, is donation, is this kind of thing. So we think that these marginal extreme groups often don't have the money to do things like influence votes under this plan because they're not popular. We think that it is actually in some ways a democratic representation of opinion because donations, because popularity leads to support. We see people like Obama, who has been fundamentally popular and has received a lot of money as a result. So we think that this isn't necessarily going to cater to these niche groups. We also heard about how it's going to mask voter apathy. What we would question is it apathy to make that personal choice? That you think that your interests in the country are best served by this direct cash return rather than a particular party? We think that we already trust voters with the right to choose. We think that this furthers their choice. We think it's actually in line with democratic ideals. And lastly, we heard about this idea that it undermines democracy, about how we can't sell our rights. We already heard a few examples of times when people do things that may sound like selling their rights, such as signing personal contracts, such as advocating a particular view in their job. But more importantly than that, we think that this is in fact a fundamental representation of their rights. That it is in fact giving them a choice about how they will best be served, how they will best be represented in the country in order to take this kind of direct return. But first I'll take you.
But a better indication of popularity is votes than whoever, like, why should a rich person have more, like, power than a poor person?
Okay, well, what we think we've heard is we've heard this very blanket view that there's these rich parties and that there's everybody else. What we've actually heard, especially through second proposition, is a slightly more nuanced view of how this system actually works. What we think that we've heard is, in fact, that how people do vote is largely based on their personal financial imperative. That if I'm a poor person and I vote for the Democrats, it may largely be because I think that their financial policy will represent me. We think that some of these people who can make the valid choice to choose that what is best represented to them is this financial return. But now I'd like to get into some of the main overarching ideas of the round. And I'd like to look at this round in terms of who are the affected parties and what's going to happen to each of them under this model. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the parties themselves, we're talking about voters, and then finally the basic democratic principles. So first of all, I want to look at the parties involved. And contrary to what opposition thinks, I think that there's actually a rather nuanced view of who are the different actors. We think, first of all, there are these rich parties who have a lot of money, who are quite capable to buy a lot of votes. And one of the things people say is one of the reasons why these people have a lot of money is because they're popular, and thank you, sir, is because they have donations. And we think that, in fact, that does help them to better represent the people. But secondly, we think that this isn't necessarily going to lead to some kind of economic-based monopoly, because we also have other parties that do in fact have money, that have resources, and most especially, we talked to you about the idea about how this can in fact benefit minor parties and benefit representation through ideas that Claudia only mentioned, such as the Green Party, who has certain amounts of popularity, who has elements of the popular vote across the country. And what this allows them to do is, rather than trying to spend all their resources in a blanket approach clear across the country, they can then focus on trying to buy votes in a particular area and actually getting representation. And we think that because their money is due to their popularity, that this allows them to exercise it in a way that helps the democratic process. We think this, in fact, helps small parties. So we don't necessarily think that we're going to have this sort of mass buying out of the system by rich parties. And I'm going to give you a further reason why that's not going to happen in my second idea, when I'm going to talk to you about voters. We think that there's two reasons, basically, why people vote. They vote on their social opinion and their social imperatives, and they vote on their personal financial imperatives. So what we've heard, I think it's quite a huge misconception inside opposition, is that we don't want to have this idea of selfish voting. We're going to say that selfish voting, as they labeled it, actually is essential to democracy. People vote based on their personal opinion, how they think the government will represent them, and their personal, as opposition would like to call it, selfish interests. We think that actually this is what we want people to do. We want them to vote based on their own interests and what will best serve them. And so we think that what happens under the status quo is a lot of people based on what they think are the financial policies of the government and what the government will do for them. And what we think is perfectly fine, especially given the right that we trust voters with the choice anyway, is to let them vote based on whether they think that a certain financial policy will serve them or whether this direct influx of cash will serve them, especially in the case of people like poor voters. We think that's actually great for them, and we think that is an important thing. Secondly, people also vote based on their social imperative. And we think that if this is sufficiently important to someone, that if they really care about policy, then they will refuse the offer to voters the vote. We think that we trust voters with that choice to vote on that instead. And as we've also talked to you about, there is an inherent accountability in the system, because what they propose to you, some party will buy up the votes and then just run the country terribly and not care about the people. But what we say is that every party always has to consider that in another few years, they will have to do this again. And if last time they completely ignored the interests of the voters, it's increasingly unlikely that they will get support. And we think that this does in fact have an inherent check on itself. And so lastly, I'd like to talk to you about the principles of democracy and how we think that this plan does in fact best serve us. Because we think that we already trust voters with a choice. We already trust them with quote-unquote selfish choices to decide what will best serve their interests. And we don't think we've heard any clear reason about why we should override this, other than this sort of kind of developed idea about it's a right and you can't sell rights, or that this undermines democracy. But what we don't think that is in fact happening, because there is money in democracy, there is already money in this political system, but what we further to is it's not just a problem that's in the system, it's actually something that can be used for the betterment of the system, something that can be used positively. I think that there is a lot of examples of money in politics interlinked in things like campaigning already. What we think is that this actually helps the system better, because it gives power to people like these minor parties to have an efficient way to concentrate the votes. It gives power to people like poor people who may vote based on who they think will help them, or they can choose to vote on what will directly help them. And we think that that, in fact, goes further the ideals of democracy. So basically, on the whole of this round, we think that what we've presented you most especially on second proposition is not just the fact that money and politics are already interlinked and will be, it's the fact that we can use this to our advantage. We can actually use this to a way to better improve the system and better represent the system. And for these reasons, we stand proudly in proposition.
Okay, I'd like to thank that speaker for her remarks and call upon the to close out this round.
Ladies and gentlemen, the government side tells you two things. They tell you that there's already, and that by giving them more money, the vote is more representative. We don't think either of those things proves why this is a good policy. We think that yes, there is money in politics, but a lot of the uses of money in politics are actually good. We think this debate crystallizes into three questions. What does democracy look like under the status quo? What are the problems of information when it comes to vote buying? And what are the consequences of vote buying? Because that's probably most important. In terms of rebuttal, I think they overlook one key point. They tell you that money is raised because people support a party, that people give donations because they like a policy. In fact, evidence suggests the exact contrary. Most policies have concentrated benefits and diverse farms. Look at the Farm Bill in the United States, or any number of abortion policies. The farmers get a direct financial benefit from this, so they advocate very hard for this policy. The harms are spread among millions of taxpayers, so it's extremely hard to rally the support and financial contributions to parties that oppose the Farm Bill, which indicates that it's fundamentally not the number of people that support a proposal that indicates a party gets money, it's the passion with which those few that get benefits believe. We see the same thing in American politics, the way that the evangelical right was able to re-elect Bush in 2004 by coming out against gay marriage. They focused on one issue, and that's passionate belief, in the same way that they give money based on one passionate belief, and hence outraise a wide variety of small donors. We think it's fundamentally false that money reflects wide appeal, it reflects passionate and fundamental support from a limited constituent. But what does democracy look like under the status quo? Well, we see two significant groups in our democracy. Those that are mostly disenfranchised and those that are relatively okay under the status quo. Those who are disenfranchised because they feel no matter what, their vote will not be represented because they don't have money to pay the special interest groups, they don't have money to pay the lobbyists, and they don't have money to pay the campaigns. And so they feel disenfranchised. And their sign of expressing this is voter apathy. They don't vote. The government proposal entirely masks that apathy, forces forces them into the process, and likely sends them, shuttling off into the hands of extremist parties, which I'll develop more. But what about those people who do vote? We think what they do is they get up there, they look at their interests, they do just like the government said, a cost-benefit analysis. Will this party's policies benefit me in the long run? Will their tax credits help me? Will their poverty programs help me? Do I support their environmental plans? Why does giving them money make the vote more representative? If anything, money is first and fundamentally a distraction. That's why it's called a bribe. If they evaluate their self-interest, the money is a distraction from their ability to calculate the costs and benefits. So we think that if anything, you place a check on the efficacy of democracy. Because the government told you there's a check in democracy. Under the status quo, people will vote out parties that they don't like the politics of. They vote them out because there's no consideration on the table other than their policies. When you add the money in, that becomes a distracting character, which you may vote in terms of the money and not voting them out based on their extremist policies. Go ahead.
Do you think it's better to have somebody vote for a party they're kind of indifferent about because they got paid, or not vote for any party at all?
I think it's better for them not to vote to any party at all. I think that's fundamentally an expression of your democratic right. There's a reason we don't mandate voting. They aren't representing their interests. They are doing a financial transaction, selling themselves just for money. It has no right in the democratic process, and it's not representative of any aspect of political will. So, what is the problems of information under a vote buying system? These are twofold, and these are severe. First, the government told you that advertising was a waste of money. We should take that money and give it directly to people. Ladies and gentlemen, our side of the House thinks advertising, debate, and discussions of policy is what democracy is about, ladies and gentlemen. It's the marketplace of ideas, fundamentally bringing the best policies forward for inspection, for debate, for discourse, so that the individuals know what they are voting for, not that they are voting for a check, ladies and gentlemen. They advocate against explaining to the public what their party is about because that money is a waste. The second problem relates to human psychology. We examine short-term consequences and long-term consequences extremely differently in nature. When you offer someone a chocolate bar now or a piece of fruit later, they take the chocolate bar now, ladies and gentlemen. It's bogus to say that they will weigh the long-term abstract consequences of tax cuts on the lowest, poorest 20% of the population versus a $150 check now. These people are not in a position to make a rational choice or to do cost benefit when you distract them with money and take the debate away from policy. But what are the consequences of vote buying? And my partner and I are clear in our extension that this places democracy fundamentally in the hands of the most extreme parties. Before I continue, go ahead.
Given the accountability that exists through elections, if a party wants someone to vote for them rather than sell their vote, won't that party just improve their policy or have a better
There's no policy that can compete with a $500 check. There is nothing you could tell me about foreign policy that compares with getting a new coach first right now. That's not what the state believes. But what happens, as my partner told you, is that special interests have those most passionate believers. They end up with the money, and then they end up with the most votes. And there are several consequences. One, how is this to stop 100 years of one-party rule? Because once you get into government, we know that president incumbency rates are about 99%. We know you have the ability to make policies, and presidencies in the United States are pretty high. We know you can make policies to give your party more money, to change campaign funds, to give yourself enough money to remain a perpetual rule. We don't see how that's democracy. But we think it's really concerning that what happens is that you get the most money because you're the most intense believers who are willing to donate, 10% of their income, like you see in evangelical churches. Then you see them buy the most votes. Then you see them implement the most extreme parties that potentially rip our democracy apart, potentially discriminate against minorities, take away reversible rights, reproductive rights, a whole variety of things. They never explore the consequences of what happens under their policy. They don't explore it short-term in terms of the kind of policies that will be implemented or the changes, and they certainly don't explore it long-term and what kind this does to voter apathy. Why will anyone in the future vote on policies when it will just become a process of bigger and bigger checks as this escalates and becomes more a process of money? Why can't Michael Bloomberg write you all a check for several $1,000s considering he's a self-made billionaire? We think this is a very real threat and that they fail to examine the implications of the radical policy they propose.